Hi everyone, we're just going to give it a couple of minutes for more people to join the meeting. After that, I'll be handing over to Laura to kick us off. So you're in the right place. Please don't go anywhere. Give us a couple of minutes. We'll go over some housekeeping and then we'll kick off. Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining this latest Reuters Events Pharma webinar. I'm going to be passing over very shortly to Laura, who's going to be chairing today and kicking us off. Just a couple of housekeeping things. We are going to be taking questions throughout the panel, so please do use the Q&A function to send through any questions that you have, and they'll be woven into the conversation as it goes. So ask as it comes up. Don't wait until the end for a Q&A period. And after the webinar, you will receive a recording of the event, probably in a couple of days' time, and we'll send one to everyone who isn't able to attend now as well. So please do feel free to share the registration link or the recording with whoever you like internally, and do then reach out to our partner Science 37 if you have any questions following up from the event as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Laura, and I hope you all enjoy the session.
Great. Thank you, Saskia. So my name is Laura Galuchie. I'm with Merck & Company if you're sitting in the US or Canada, and I'm with MSD if you're joining us from any place else in the world today. So I'm thrilled to have a wonderful group of panelists with me here today. And I'm going to start it off by asking each one of them to introduce themselves, and you'll understand in just a moment why we're all gathered here. So Lionel, I'm going to start with you, please.
Thank you, Laura. My name is Lionel Bascles. I'm based out of Paris. I'm working for Sanofi. I'm the global head for clinical science and operation, which is a team designing and conducting clinical trials for Sanofi company.
Great, thank you. David?
I'm David Coman. I'm the CEO of Science 37. And for those who don't know what Science 37 is, we're an operating system really to enable decentralized clinical trials. So that means we have a platform that enables workflow and evidence generation and data harmonization. And then on top of that, specialized networks that include patient communities and telemedicine investigators, mobile nurses, et cetera, all designed to enable decentralization to happen.
Thank you. Melissa.
Hi, I'm Melissa Penn. I work for Bayer in advocacy relations. So I work with the patient advocacy groups and professional societies. So really happy to be here to be talking about one of our favorite topics to talk about, patient engagement in clinical trials. And the views that I expressed today are my own.
Thank you. And Joy.
Thank you. Great to join you all. I'm Joy Bosai. I am a hospital medicine physician by training at Duke. I'm also the CEO and co-founder of Pluto Health. Pluto Health bridges siloed data automated in an automated fashion, where we bring together pieces of data from all over the US and address healthcare gaps for patients. I was previously Chief of Digital Health at the Duke Clinical Research Institute. So really glad to join you.
Great. Thank you very much. So you'll see we'll have a good variety of perspectives and backgrounds to help us in our conversation talk about decentralized clinical trials. So I'll call it DCT for short. So I know we have a varied audience with us today. So for some of you, this is new, getting to understand what a DCT is and what it is not. And for others, you're probably itching to understand some more very details and how companies are approaching different things. So we're going to try to touch a lot of bases today. So I'm going to start with just a simple definition for our call. So DCT is not a single paradigm of running a clinical trial. It's a collection of different approaches which are fit for purpose based on whatever product or population you're studying. And many of these components that are part of DCTs have been around for quite some time. So you'll think of eCOA, formerly eDiaries. You'll have telemedicine and home healthcare approaches. Other activities to bring activities to the trial patient or participant. E-consent is another example. So we'll touch on several of those today, but mostly if we're talking about decentralized clinical trials, we'll think about all of the different moving parts and pieces and how you think about the best ones for the situation at hand. So with that in mind as a background, Lionel, can I ask the first question to you? Can you talk a little bit about some of the factors that you and your teams think about when you're trying to support that balance of what to use in a DCT?
Yeah, absolutely, Laura. So first, I do agree with you. I mean, you listed a number of components of DCT, decentralized trials, that have been existing for a while. You had already a long list. I could also name the direct-to-patient drug supply. And we've seen during the pandemic that despite this best practice existed before, it has surged as a way to really maintain the patients on treatment during the pandemic. At Sanofi, for instance, we had more than 2,000 last year, which is probably 100 times more than we used to do on normal time. So I guess that DCT to me is the way to integrate all those components, leveraging technology to build a reliable patient platform. And again, there is a trust between physician and the patient, and the technology and the DCT component should strengthen that relationship, that unique relationship. So this is not a trivial decision that we take when we run DCT, and we should really look into, ask ourselves a few questions. So first is, it should be built into the protocol. It should not be a tactic. It should be a strategy upfront. We've been running DCT for a while. I mean, as we partner with the Science 37 I guess it was in the 2016 timeframe, and it has to be built in. Which visits, which assessment, what are the tools that exist that we can leverage, and are they reliable? Then I mentioned about DTP, but is it convenient based on the drug itself? What are the services that we need to rebuild around the patient? What is the ecosystem? Is it possible in every country? Because that may be a topic that we will discuss later. And then, is it home visit, or are we talking about a local community clinic visit around nearby patient home? And in that case, what does it mean in terms of site definition and site responsibilities? So these are a few questions that I ask the team to ask to themselves before we come to the decision of a DCT. And one additional component is patient and site buy-in, because you said it. It should not be one size fits all. It should be, what's the patient preference? And I'm sure Melissa will touch upon this patient topic, is that the main stakeholder of a study is the patient. What does it mean for the patient to be maintained at home? Is it a preference? So we need to understand what's the clinical practice, what's the patient preference, and we've been engaging site and patient for a while. And I can finish on one example where we can make the difference. So we are running a study in ITP, so immunothrombocytopenic purpura. And not knowing much about the patient population, we engaged with the patient association, patient panel, and we discovered that it was a medium in terms of digital interest, medium level, like me, nothing more, nothing less. But a huge interest in adopting new tools, engaging with new tools, and in order to manage the disease. And another key features was the activity on social media, really to share experience. So based on those elements, we said, okay, we have a good ground to double down on social media to create awareness for the clinical trials and try to bring the clinical trials to the patients where they are, on top of having a direct to patient in a way to really encourage them to try new tools. So again, you said it, this is not one size fits all.
Great, thank you very much for that. So Joy, the next question will be coming to you. So we've been talking about choice and having the protocol structured so that there is an element of flexibility. Patients and participants do like to have some choice, but does that put the investigator in the middle? How have you seen investigators and clinical sites responding to these varied approaches?
I actually think there's been quite pretty good feedback about a hybrid approach. I think the idea of a one size fits all, we have to move beyond that and think about what really fits for the patient. So what makes it easy and convenient for them to continue to participate in a trial. From an investigator standpoint, I think if you make the process easy for patients, if you make it easy for them to continue to follow up and access the trial and continue with, their day-to-day workflow, the feedback actually has been quite supportive. So I think it's a very interesting move forward in the clinical trial space.
Great. If I could just follow up a little bit on that, have you seen any shifts as some trials moved to this DCT approach?
We actually have. So because of COVID-19, we've had to shift a number of trials into either a completely siteless trial or a hybrid approach. And we've actually found that a number of investigators have really enjoyed being able to perform the trial at an efficient pace and continue to remain connected with their patients without relying on the traditional four walls of a clinic. So it's been quite nice.
Thank you for that perspective. So obviously we started with a sponsor perspective, a site perspective, and you certainly need a patient as part of your clinical trial. And in the past, we would have hear industry conversations about increasing awareness so that more people could potentially be participants in clinical trial. Melissa, can you share a little bit of what you've been observing from your area?
Sure. So certainly at this moment in time, there is increased awareness of clinical trials in general, right? Because of the COVID vaccine trials and the fact that this is now part of our national and even our global discourse, there's certainly increased awareness. I think where we have the greatest opportunity is now, how do we get increased understanding? And we can do that on a couple of fronts. One is about clinical trials in general, right? And DCT, what is that? And then, of course, the next step is also going to be trial specific and all the materials that are involved there, right? From the educational materials to the informed consent. And there is a way to do this and really take this moment to increase understanding and trust. And there's some guiding principles in how to do that, right? So you hear us talk a lot about plain language. How do we do it with simple, concise language? And in a way that really reflects the patient experience in a tone that is conversational and human. And to do that best, we need to co-create these materials with patients and patient advocacy groups in the trusted partners in the community. And that way we can reflect patient experiences. We can use phrases that people use when they talk to their doctors. We can do it in a culturally competent way. But this is an ongoing iterative process with consistent feedback. It is not a one and done, talk to the patients, get their view on X, Y, and Z in DCT. It's a continual process.
Right. And Melissa, is that I assume it's a two-way conversation?
it is always a bi-directional
Yeah.
conversation, ongoing, respectful, listening, but it's a great question because that has to be bi-directional.
Great, thank you. So David, I'll round out the first question to you. We've talked about different areas of clinical trials. In the past, there's been a lot of focus on, I'll use the word interoperability of data, but as you can see by our conversation thus far, there's a lot more components that need to be able to connect and talk to each other in a DCT format. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the approaches you and your company have taken to do interoperability beyond just data?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's interoperability of people. And so, just think about the workflow of, of a decentralized or a hybrid study. It has to start with a patient, as Melissa said, making that super easy for a patient to understand what you're about to get into, why you're getting into what you're about to get into, and then what are the expected steps as you go through. But then ultimately, you've got to connect that patient into an investigator. And in telemedicine world, sometimes that's most of the time that's actually a new introduction. And so then think about the workflow between the patient and the investigator, or the intermediary between the two of them, which would be a remote coordinator, and ensuring that those ultimately comes down to conversations, right? So the human connection of the patient to the coordinator, to the investigator, and then potentially a mobile nurse that comes into the home. These are all individual people that are, living their day-to-day lives and have a million different distractions. And so how do you make that as simple as possible to expedite what ultimately needs to happen, which is, a care conversation in the context of a trial. And so there is the technology underpinning all of this stuff has to make it extraordinarily easy to, to connect all the dots.
Thank you for that. If I can stay on the topic of data for a moment, with all of these new technologies that are currently available, some of them are really integral to having a decentralized clinical trial, collecting that data wherever that patient or participant may be. Lionel, can you talk a little bit about the real world evidence and these new endpoints and new types of data that are being considered in clinical trials?
Sure, Laura. So I guess that's with if we really want to fully unleash the power of the decentralized clinical trials or remote follow-up of the patients, we need to deploy new tools. There are a number of tools existing, but developing a tool to become an endpoint, for instance, is a different journey. It's a full journey. And we've been doing that at Sanofi. I can take the example of on Parkinson's disease with the UPDRS, Unified Parkinson's Disease Rating Scale, which is a very cumbersome scale to digitize it, not only on digitize all the element of it, but to rebuild a new scales with outcome data and assessment. So a new scale, or at least a new element, a new endpoint. And actually, it's really the same. We need to take the same steps as the drug development steps. There is a research steps during which we scoping, we're looking at the technical features, what exists. Then we move to a phase 1, which is more in terms of usability, we have the pharmacokinetic or this phase 1 study in healthy volunteers. So here you really look into, can you use that tools? What would be the value of it? Then you move to a proof of concept in a limited number of patients, making sure that they can really use that tool and there is some relevance. And then you go to the validation of the tool and the qualification. So I guess this is so that means that it's a really a strategic investment that needs to be made. There are a number of initiatives that are being run also, because I believe there is a collaboration cross pharma and academic. There are a number of initiatives under IMI, but also in Europe, but other work is being done across the world to really build on each other understanding. And then when comes, I mean, the other elements I would like to highlight is the change in paradigm. As we go into a remote monitoring, we're going to increase dramatically the number of data. So on today basis, a study is what, 10 million data points that we have on average. But what does it mean as we move to 24/7 data collection for health rate, for instance? How do we analyze that? What's the relevance of all the data points we will get? So instead of having looking at differences and we will have to look at trends. So this was a discussion that we had with that pharma association got with the FDA in October last year when presenting the DCT model and the new data collection that will come with it. How do we move to a more some statistical monitoring of the data? So these are points that we need to take care. Again, to finish on my favorite topic, which is the patient, is that what does it mean for the patient? Because as we move to decentralized trials, we don't want to push the burden on the patient, you know, having those not fancy tools, but what does it mean for them? How compliant they can be with it? And the compliance, for me, it's a question of direct benefit. For a patient, they will take the drug if they feel a benefit for that drug. The same will come to the tools that we're going to force to them. If we force them to the patients, I don't believe the compliance will be very high. But if they can find a benefit in terms of managing their disease, looking at the progress, looking at the relapse, for instance, and engaging with the doctor in the next few visits, that would make a difference.
Great, thank you. So, Joy, you know, Lionel just talked quite a bit about, you know, patients and data. Can you share any experiences that you have with, you know, how patients are responding or participants are responding to this availability of data?
Absolutely. Before I get into that, I just want to comment or riff off what Lionel just said about endpoints. I think it's extremely important to involve the patient because patients' involvement can enrich the trial and the way which we analyze the data. So it's hard to analyze an endpoint without understanding the context for which the data is coming in. An example is like if I'm rounding in the hospital and the nurse calls me and says, this patient's heart rate is like 140, you need to come to the bedside immediately. You know, I need to know if the patient's being active, walking around, did they just try to, walk the hallways, or are they just sitting and resting in bed? So you interpret data in a variety of ways, and patients can provide very powerful context as to what's going on at home as we interpret the data coming in. So I think that's important. And to answer your question, Laura, I think what patients really care about is how does this benefit me, but also how do I make sure that my harms are reduced? So one of the things that we really care about at Pluto is basically privacy and security, making sure that the data is not going to be quote unquote de-identified and monetized in the back end. And so one of the biggest concerns about adopting technologies in a trial is the scary notion of having a big brother watching over you. You know, we have tools that can monitor, that can sit, in your ceiling and watch to see if you've had a fall or look at your motions throughout the day and things like that. But I think the most important thing is to make sure that patients feel comfortable having these tools around and that they won't be harmed in the end. So I think that's an important thing. Another thing that to consider when we're implementing things in the field is how do we make sure that the technology or the DCT tool is going to be adopted, right? So it's one thing to provide a technology and say, hey, good luck, hook up everything and make sure that it works. And so every patient is going to respond to that differently. So how do you have the support system in place to make sure that you are distributing the tool in an equitable fashion? And if it can't be adopted, do we have hybrid approaches that will address participation?
So Joy, you used a word in that responsive equity, and Melissa, in our prep for this, we've talked a little bit about the equity, and has the current situation increased the number of patients or participants who could actually join a clinical trial. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that? And have you seen any adjustment in adoption rates across different populations?
Yeah, thank you for the question, because it is the topic that every one of our organizations wants to talk about. And in fact, the FDA and pharma have really prioritized enhancing diversity in clinical trials. And this is a space that has led to underrepresentation. And so when we think about improving health outcomes and reducing disparities, it really is essential that our clinical trials include adequate representation of the populations who are going to be using the drug if approved. And so do we have an opportunity here with DCT? And in fact, is it possible that DCT actually sits at the intersection between underrepresentation and traditional barriers to clinical trials? And I certainly think there is that opportunity done correctly to really improve access and reduce barriers. And some of those barriers include barriers to transportation, whether city or rural. Hours, that's just the time it takes for people to participate in a clinical trial, does not work with most people's work schedule. And of course, there is childcare, elder care, dog care. I mean, as somebody else said, there's a million reasons. I think David talked about that. There are so many reasons that it's been difficult. And so, we talked before about the need for education, but we need to actually make it accessible. And so I think that we've seen the needle move a little bit, and we really do have an opportunity here. And there's a number of components to that, including the education that we sort of touched on before, and working with trusted partners in the community, right? Working with the patient advocacy groups, churches, and other trusted partners. There's an aspect of that I've seen sort of a number of our organizations really look towards, which is working with historically Black colleges and universities who have med schools, and trying to get people interested earlier and understanding that we need representation from investigators too. So we do have an opportunity, and DCT is one of the ways I think that we can try to lead the way in terms of equity.
Great, thank you.
Laura,
David,
would you allow me to
sure.
comment 2 minutes? So I think it's a great topic, and I fully agree with everything Melissa said. One aspect is that let's not, and this is not what you said absolutely, Melissa, but making sure for the audience that we don't believe that DCT is the only tool and the only solution, because we have to make sure we understand the root cause when we don't have a good representation of all the communities. But that can be a key element. Either going through where the patient is and making sure that they don't have to travel, or connecting a main sites to community sites where there is a different population and accessing to a different population. And also, to your point earlier, Melissa, awareness and education is key. But we have also to look at the protocol itself. Are there any bias in the protocol, and exclusion criteria, for instance, that would reduce the participation of some part of the population versus others? Understand all the barrier that we may create in terms of digital access, in terms of Wi-Fi. Remember that we had a different patient association in the US, and one of them claimed that be careful because Wi-Fi is not a universally shared resource. So what do we need to do to understand all of that? So I guess that and Melissa said it right, but this is not only one option. There is all those aspects to be considered, and DCT may change, maybe a game changer, definitely.
Right.
Yeah, so that's a great point, and it really goes to working with the patient. And of course, we know that there's a whole bunch of topics to that, including whether that actually works with the study, but you're absolutely right. And we are not to just assume that everybody wants full DCT. And I think I've heard a lot about that and the need for hybrid, right? But there's a lot of assumptions that we actually need to work with the groups to ensure that that's actually correct, including data and wearables and a number of topics in there. But it really does, as you keep saying, go back to the patient. So assuming that everybody wants full DCT is just an assumption, right?
Yeah.
That's actually not what we're hearing. And I think somebody was saying that in the beginning.
So, obviously patients come into a clinical trial through a physician or an investigator, and the formation of that site can be different now. David, can you talk to us a little bit more about site networks and how you've seen those structured and utilized?
I mean, I guess I'll build on the conversation we were just having too. I mean, I think we all know the statistic that only about 8% of any patient ever is contacted about joining a clinical research study, and that is predominantly a geographic issue because only 5% of participants are ever requested to join a clinical research study. I'm sorry, sorry, let me get my dogs over here. So only 5% of providers are ever participating in clinical research. So, ultimately, if you need to look at the rest of the 92% of the population, how do you engage them? How do you get them to participate in any given way? So you have to look beyond a traditional site network and think about how you could execute differently. And so what we're seeing is studies in which we're identifying the patient. It could be through a provider, and I'm using that word very intentionally. It could be through social media. It could be through a pharmacy network. It could be through a lab. But identifying those patients where they sit, and then reverse engineering, how do you get those patients, get the data that you need from those patients in order to figure out the efficacy and safety of a study or of a compound. Now, if you reverse engineer it, sometimes that looks like you find them, you pull them into a coordinator, you execute fully decentralized with a telemedicine investigator and a mobile nurse that comes to the home. It also could look like you find them, you engage them, you do procedures at a local facility rather than those procedures being done at a traditional clinical trial site. And so you have all sorts of options in terms of how you execute in order to drive. Ultimately, you need to get the patients into the trial. And so I'll keep on going if you don't mind. I mean, there's another permutation to this, which is all about getting the more diverse patient populations, which is, where I know, Melissa was going with it. And, the reality of what we're seeing is, about 30% of, traditional sites are getting about 30% participation of what they need in terms of some of the communities of color. If you take a look at what we're experiencing in a decentralized world, we're just about like the population, actually a little bit skewed more to diversity. And the reason is because the site networks aren't excluding them in some capacity. But there's also the specific targeting that you need in order to fill the gaps that are typically present in a traditional network. And so this is why we make some of the investments. I don't know if you knew, we just recently announced the Diversity in Clinical Research Foundation. We're making some investments very specifically to encourage participation amongst underserved populations. That's from a patient perspective and from a provider perspective. All in touch with this idea of not just the social aspect of clinical research, for being available to everybody, but really for the scientific. And so when you bring this into a commercial setting, you really have to have a representative population, and DCT certainly can fill that void.
Thank you. Joy, would you mind expanding on that a little bit from a...
Sure. I'd like to say that it's extremely important to meet patients where they are. I don't think it's enough to just hope that a patient finds out about a trial through a site or a provider. I think it's important that we try to shift the model a little bit, and we have seen this grow throughout the years, and think about how do we integrate participation into the workflow of the day-to-day care of a patient. So there are many providers that are not aware of trials out there, as there are many patients that aren't aware. So how do we make sure that we can get the word out and be part of the care process of a patient and kind of bridge the two worlds? I think that's really important. You know, we can also think about meeting patients where they are by deploying tools that are not just about one specific trial, and hope that the patient adopts a tool, a DCT tool, just for one trial, and then just kind of, you know, they'll kind of go off on their merry way after a trial ends. But think about tools that could really live with the patient throughout the course of their lifetime and throughout their care. And I think that, you know, leads to opportunities of engagement for patients later on, even after a trial ends. So I think that's something that we could consider as a community.
Thank you. The other part of when a clinical trial ends, I mean, we conduct clinical trials for the purpose of potentially submitting, you know, registrational packages for products to be eventually available in the marketplace. So many of our companies are global. So we've been talking about DCTs, but we haven't been concentrating on one geography over the other than, you know, a city versus rural. Lionel, would you mind talking a little bit about being with a global company, and you're sitting in a different country than I am? Would you mind being able to give us a little bit of a perspective of what you're hearing in terms of acceptability of some of these approaches?
Yes, and it's a good question. It's interesting because there are a lot of questions in the Q&A related to that topic. Yeah. And they are great questions. So indeed, the practice is different. And I guess it's beyond the practice. And you said it, Joy. I mean, I wish in the future our clinical trials are more considered part of the patient health journey, you know, more integrated into the as a treatment option, and that whatever we deploy on the clinical trials, it echoes what exists in the general practice. In the clinical practice, and after the trials, they can continue with some of the tools. So DCT, we've been able to run DCT in a few countries. There is a question around acceptability. I guess that agencies are not looking much into the DCT component. They are more worried about, the question would be the data, the reliability of the data, the quality of the data, the traceability of the data, the privacy, and data privacy as well. And the way we're going to analyze the data, or we're going to deal with the data, the failure, you know, the missing data when a tool is not working. So these are the questions. And again, we met with the FDA last year. We've been meeting with the EMEA a couple of weeks ago, and there's a lot of traction behind DCT. But I guess it's a cultural shift that is happening. And someone was asking about survey. I mean, I don't have any survey to refer, but we know that the uptake of telehealth is growing, and the pandemic has accelerated that. Still a lot of progress to be made, but we still have some patients very reluctant. We're running a study in multiple sclerosis, and some of those patients don't want to go to the hospital and have agreed to be part of the DCT. Indeed, it does require to put in place some services like study nurses, home nurses, and there are some differences. In China, very difficult to have home nursing, very difficult. So we have to work with local community. Okay, that's the little difference. You know, the devil is in the details, and technically we can. The technology is there, but the culture is not there, or the local service. In France, for instance, I've seen a number of agency opening really dedicated to home nursing, and they are really understanding that there is a need, there is a business almost to really be around the patients. So I think that here again, when we launch into the city, we have to understand where there is an opportunity and what is the infrastructure and what is in the country, on the market itself, what will be the opportunity or the challenge to have this adoption.
Great. David, I know you've had some experiences around the world, you know, working with decentralized trials. Would you share some of those with us, please?
I mean, I think when you're thinking globally, there's really three factors. I would say there's a language factor, and so making sure that you can execute in language. And right now we've translated ourselves into 40 different languages, and there's a technical issue behind that too, because there's not just sort of different orders of different characters, but there's different types of characters, and there's left to right, right to left, and everything in between. And so from a technology standpoint, it's super important. From a societal or cultural standpoint, it's super important. So, in Japan is very different in terms of the way they look at home healthcare versus the way they look at it in Germany and in the United States. And so making sure that you not only understand the language, but also the societal issues, and then beyond that, the regulatory issues. And so from a regulatory standpoint, it's US alone, I mean, you've got to think about each individual state. So there's a California Bill of Rights that you have to include in your regs. You have to do the same thing across each individual country. And so we've put a lot of investment in terms of understanding what that looks like country to country around the world, and ensuring that the acceptability of e-consent or e-COA, or can you send a nurse into the home? Can you refer from a telemedicine doc to a local provider, the telemedicine PI to a local provider to get those procedures done? All of these things are nuances that have to be thought about when you're thinking about globalization of your trials.
Thank you. Melissa, I mean, you've talked about getting feedback from the patient. Can you talk a little bit about getting this global perspective as well?
So in the beginning, when I talked about culturally competent materials and info, it needs to be done with the groups of patients that you're looking at. It has to be representative. So you actually need to go to where you're doing the trial and work with experts in the area and trusted people in whatever community it is to make sure that you're getting the patient input. So obviously there's the different regulatory aspects of global, but there is the common need of working with the patient, and whatever is the trusted partner in that community, and that will look different globally, that's where we need to start.
Great.
But you cannot, certainly, and I think everybody's saying the same thing, you can't assume that what one group in the US wants is going to be applicable, or that's not going to work for your trial.
So Joy, one of the things that we talked about is using clinical trials as a care option. So we've talked about how we can bring the trial to the patient. Well, how can you talk to us a little bit about having this plethora of access to different patients and different choices that the clinician can use with his or her patient? Can you expand on that a little bit for us?
Sure. So, there are patients in the past where, my colleagues have referred to clinical trials simply because they didn't have insurance, they couldn't afford the medications, but yet if they participate in a trial, they can continue to gather care. And there are nuances, and we can talk about the hairy ethics around that. But at the end of the day, what the patient cares about is my condition being managed, and am I getting the care that I need? So the more and more that we can move to bridging clinical care with research, I think it makes the landscape a bit more accessible and equitable across a variety of populations. One of the things I wanted to touch upon that Melissa and David their comments had me thinking about was when we deploy tools for patients and we think about adopting technologies and implementing them for DCTs, I think especially in the global sense, I think it's especially important to make sure that the tools are readily available to all the populations. So we've encountered this where, at Duke, we've had vendors where their tool only works with the latest version of iOS, and then they leave everyone out. And then we forget about the Droid population. And then we forget about, it can only work on Wi-Fi. Well, some patients in rural North Carolina don't have Wi-Fi, but they might have other tools to communicate. So I think on a global perspective, we have to think about the patients first and the technologies second and the capabilities. And so really understanding what it means to connect with the patients. It goes from both a clinical level in terms of like how they access care, but also when they are in a trial, how do we make sure that we can continue to work with a diverse population?
Great, thank you for that. So I'm looking through some of the questions in the Q&A, and I think we've answered quite a few of them. We've talked about the digital, we've talked about DCTs in different countries. I'm seeing some questions about I'll say data privacy considerations. We've touched on that a little bit in our responses, but David, I was wondering if you'd like to expand and talk a little bit about some of the questions that you've been receiving and how different approaches to addressing those questions on data privacy elements.
PHI protection, GDPR, all these to apply to everything that we're doing. So yeah, the good news is if you take a look at GDPR in particular, I mean, it's extraordinarily comprehensive and a terrific way for us to manage patient data as sort of a leading function that's globally, even though it's more of a EU reg. Thinking about that on a global basis is really a good North Star for everybody. There are some country or site specific regs that you have to keep in mind, and I think I've talked about those already. I think that covers it.
Great, thank you. So looking at the clock here, we have about 15 minutes left before the close of our session. So I'm going to open this up to our panelists to see if there's any last points or comments that you'd like to make sure that our audience hears from you today.
I can start. I mean, there are, I mean, yes, we haven't addressed all the questions, but they are very, first I would like to, there's one on the cost, and Kara is asking that. We share the same experience. Indeed, today, DCT is a very costly approach when we set up that as an option. So this is why having that integrated into our protocol, really embedded into the protocol from the beginning, understanding the benefit, that would be is good. But yes, it's an expensive approach. And then I really believe into the way Science37 is handling it in terms of data integration. There's so many tools that we can deploy on the front end, but then we have to understand what does it mean for the patient, the convenience for the patient. Ourselves, when we have to log on different application system, phones, that's a headache. If we can have everything integrated for the patient at the front end, it's so good for the patient. Remember, the sites were complaining a few years ago about all the tools and system we could push to them. So having one front end is great. But then on the back end, because the objective is to make the rapid decision on the treatment. And so having those data integrated is absolutely critical. And that's probably one of the challenge of the future. Remember, I come from the century when clinical trials were run with a paper CRF. Some of you may remember that, but only few. But then now, at that time, almost 100% of the data were coming from those CRF. Now, a CRF data represent eCRF data represents 30%, 40%. The rest come from different sources. So if you really want to be able to look comprehensively, holistically at the patient profile and make decision on when you have those seamless approach or basket trials, making sure that we have rapid decision, we have to integrate that. So that's really the one necessity.
Great, thank you for those comments. Who would like to go next? David?
Sure. We've had some conversation today about, when to utilize decentralization, when not to. I think we should broaden our aperture a little bit. and not think so much in a binary world where you're thinking, do I have a choice between traditional or is the option to go fully decentralized? I think the reality is, the trial of the future is going to be much more messy, and you're going to have some patients who are going to want to work from home, or are unable to go to a site and have to do some things at home. You're going to have some investigators who are going to only have patients that are coming live, and some of them are going to only have patients that are remote. But more likely, you're going to have a mix of both. And so, if you think about this muddy world of the future, you really have to start thinking about how do you execute that? Because ultimately, you're doing this because you want to accelerate research. You want to accelerate, you get as many patients in as possible that fit the protocol, and you want to get the trial started as fast as possible and completed as fast as possible, so that you can make sure that the efficacy and safety data is fully discovered. So in order to execute in the trial of the future, you really have to have a network of investigators that are, traditional, it's the 5% that's currently, listed today, but then thinking about beyond more, the newer to research providers, and how do you engage them and pull them in? You have to think about, site networks and nurse networks and remote coordinators and all those things. But most importantly, you have to have a platform that's going to have the flexibility to move between an in-premise and an off-premise situation dynamically, and then capture all the data across all the elements, centralize those things into one place so that you can have submittable data.
Thank you. So Joy, I'm going to move to you. So any last comments or responses to some of the points that have been brought up?
Yeah, I would say, I guess two things I want to bring up as we think about the DCT space. I'm coming at it from a data perspective, so I'll touch on that. One is that we have to be really careful about the policies that you engage in when you think about or consider vendors, or think about integrating tools for trials. We experience this a lot as an academic institution, where once you get into the contracting phase, you realize that the privacy policies are really scary, and then we would abandon and not go forward. And so one of those things is making sure that the data stays within the trial, making sure that the company can commit to not even selling de-identified data, because that can go back and harm patients. Because as we well know, de-identified data can be re-identified quite easily. There was recently a publication by one of my colleagues at Duke, published in the New England Journal, outlining how this can come back and harm patients. So that's something to consider. The other thing I want to impress upon, and I've said this, I feel like multiple times, so sorry for being a broken record. The more and more we can bridge care and make the workflow easy for patients, the better it is, right? So thinking about longitudinal tools that stay with patients throughout their care, that helps improve their care, only enriches our access to research and data later on. I think it's time to stop thinking about one-off solutions just for one trial, and really push ourselves to think, how do we integrate and be involved with patients for the long run?
Thank you. So that leaves us with Melissa to close on patients, which is, and participants, which is what, all the clinical trials are about.
So sort of taking a page from Joy's book, right, in the longitudinal engagement, we're hoping it continues after clinical trials. So I'll start at the beginning, right? It starts with trust. You need to build that at the inception, or you're not going to have anything else. So that's the bottom layer. And that is the essential component of how we're effectively communicating early on. And then to build that trust, we need to show that we're actually incorporating the feedback consistently. So it starts at the beginning, and it is patient involvement from the inception. And Lionel mentioned protocols. Like, we need it every step of the way. And then if we build the trust and the engagement, the patient involvement in the whole process should then continue after the trial. And then I guess to sort of sum it all up, is that there is no blueprint right now, right? We are sort of watching, and we all get to witness best practices in the making. So we do have a really beautiful and exciting opportunity right here.
Great. Thank you for that. And I know there are no blueprints, but I can share that, and I've seen a question in the Q&A of are there surveys and templates available? If you go to the Transcelerate website, so transceleratebiopharmainc.com, that you will find some tools that you can use and reference. So the first area is within patient experience. There are some tools that you can use to get input from patients and also understand what are the components that you can think about during that patient journey. And additionally, there is a work stream called Modernization of Clinical Trials Conduct, and they have some feedback and experiences that they're sharing that touch on many of the topics that we've touched on today. So again, it's not a blueprint, but it is certainly a series of tools that you can leverage depending on what your company perspective is to help advance this area forward. So with those references in mind, I'll turn it back to Saskia to tell us a little bit more about what we can expect in the final recording and other information feeding back to us.
Hi all, thank you so much for that really fantastic session. So yeah, we will be sending around recordings probably today or tomorrow. Please do share that with anyone who wasn't able to attend. And if you do want to get in contact with any of our fantastic panelists today, please feel free to shoot me over an email. That's saskia.burbach@reutersevents.com. You'll have received, I'm sure, thousands of emails from me by this point. So do shoot that over to me and I can pass it on to the relevant panelists. And also this webinar was sort of produced. The topic was all developed in tandem with Science 37. So if you've got any further questions about anything that they can provide or the topic or anything like that, please do take a look at their website or again, shoot me over that email and I can pass you over to David. But I think that's everything from us. We'll give you back 4 minutes of your time. Thank you so much, everyone, and hope to see you all again soon.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.